Good evening, everyone, and welcome on behalf of the Maryland chapter of the Sierra Club to this webinar on chemical recycling, also known as advanced recycling of plastic, a false solution to the plastic pollution crisis. I'm Martha Ainsworth, the chair of the Maryland Sierra Club Zero Waste team, and I'll be your moderator for the evening. At this webinar, you'll learn about the plastic recycling problem, what's meant by chemical or advanced recycling of plastic, and is it really recycling? Its impact on human health, its carbon and energy footprint, its economic viability, and where it's currently being practiced. We're so pleased that you can join us this evening, and I'd like to extend a special welcome to several members of the General Assembly. Delegate Benjamin Brooks from District 10 in Baltimore County, Delegate Laura Charkoudian from District 20 in Montgomery County, Delegate Mary Lehman from District 21 in Anne Arundel and Prince George's counties, Delegate Sara Love, District 16 from Montgomery County, Delegate Lily G, District 15 from Montgomery County, and Delegate Jen Terrassa from District 13 in Howard County. Thank you all for coming. Before introducing our speaker, I'd like to go over a few logistical issues. Because of the large number of attendees, all will be muted during the presentation, but questions will be taken at the end. You don't have to wait till the end, however, to type a question in the Q&A function on your screen. We ask you to please use the Q&A function for your questions and all other remarks and sharing of comments on the chat. If you have a technical difficulty, you can contact our technical support, Gary Young, in the chat. Please address those issues to him. At the end of the presentation, we'll read off the questions in order. And if you're a delegate, please indicate that you have a question in the Q&A, and I will invite you to unmute and activate your video to ask that question. Thank you. The webinar is being recorded and will be available on the Maryland Sierra Club website. In fact, we will send a link to it to everyone who is registered. So I'm now very pleased to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Neil Tangri. Neil is the Science and Policy Director of Gaia, the Global Alliance for Incinerator Alternatives, a global network of 800 organizations working towards zero waste. A climate scientist and oceanographer by training, Neil's campaigned at the local level for solutions to municipal waste, inadequate water supply, air pollution, and lead poisoning. At the international level, he's worked on marine plastic pollution, climate change finance, carbon markets, inclusion of the informal sector, polyvinyl chloride and mercury bans, and an end to waste incineration. He's led policy advocacy campaigns directed at international institutions, including the Clean Development Mechanism, the United Nations Framework on Climate Change, the Green Climate Fund, the International Finance Corporation, and the World Bank. He has a PhD from Stanford University and holds a captain's license from the US Coast Guard. Neil has lived in the US, India, the UK, and Mexico, and speaks English, Spanish, and Hindi. Now, following Neil's presentation, we will invite Delegate Sara Love to preview legislation she's sponsoring in the 2021 General Assembly to address this issue. Sara? Delegate Love was elected to the House of Delegates in 2018 to represent District 16 in Montgomery County and is a member of the House Environment and Transportation Committee. Prior to her election, she was Public Policy Director for the ACLU of Maryland, where she led their policy and legislative program for 4 years. Before working for the ACLU, she served as the General Counsel and Legal Director of NARAL, the Pro-Choice America, where she worked on federal reproductive rights policy and led a staff to support affiliates across the country working on state policy. She graduated from Princeton University and the Northwestern University School of Law. So now, without further ado, I will invite Dr. Neil Tangri to launch his presentation. Take it away, Neil.
Thank you very much for that introduction. And thank you to everyone here for taking an hour out of your evening to be with us. I'm going to show you a few slides. I'll try to keep this relatively short so that we have time for Q&A afterwards. Just as I begin, I did want to say a few words about my organization, Gaia. We're a global network of more than 800 organizations in 90 countries, grassroots environmental justice organizations, all working to end incineration and implement zero waste. So like you, we have been hearing quite a lot about chemical recycling recently. The petrochemical industry claims that this is the solution to the plastic problem. It's going to generate new jobs and investment. And as champions of zero waste, we are always very interested in new recycling technologies. So we've done a very deep dive recently into chemical recycling, and I'm going to present just the top level findings of a few of our recent reports, but you can find much more on our website. So, context. It's no secret that we have a problem with plastic recycling. Very little plastic is actually recycled. Most of what's collected is contaminated, it's unusable, being wrong polymers and such, or it ends up being downcycled. The problem is primarily economic. Virgin plastic is dirt cheap, and collecting, washing, sorting, chipping, all of that, the waste plastic is quite expensive. So plastic recycling really just cannot compete against virgin plastic. Industry's solution to this is chemical recycling. So you've probably seen the big announcement from the American Chemistry Council about billions invested in, now they're calling it advanced recycling because their polling indicated that people are a little suspicious of chemical recycling, but it's just a name change. There's actually a recent Greenpeace report showing that very little of this touted investment is actually real, and most of these projects are not moving forward. But that begs the question, what is chemical recycling? And unfortunately, there is no standard definition. It is a set of technologies that break plastic down into its components. So as you'll remember, plastic is primarily long chain hydrocarbon polymers. This is PET showing on the screen now. That's mixed with a lot of different fillers and additives to give it the wide range of properties that we're familiar with plastic. The idea is to break this down, these polymers down, with a combination of heat, pressure, and solvents. And they do this in an oxygen depleted chamber. The low oxygen is really critical to prevent the plastic from simply catching fire, because after all, plastic is made from fossil fuels and it likes to go back to being a fossil fuel. So the idea is the result should be monomers, these basic chemical building blocks of plastic. But it's also really critical to strip out all the additives and contaminants that are in plastic, because there's no way to put those back into new plastic. So the technology types are mostly pyrolysis and gasification. These are kind of two rather similar technologies that, again, involve heat, depleted oxygen, pressure, and sometimes solvents. And they produce a gas byproduct, an oil product, and a solid product, which we call char. Pyrolysis produces more oil than gas. Gasification produces more gas than oil. In addition, there are some other variants on the process. Every company has a slightly different variation with a different name. But at the 30,000 foot level, these are the basic technology types that we're looking at. So how does chemical recycling fit into the plastic life cycle, if I can even call it a life cycle? If we start up here at the top left of the screen, almost all plastic starts life as either petroleum or natural gas. In the US, most of it's made from natural gas. And it goes to the right through a series of manufacturing steps until it becomes the plastic products that we're familiar with. Those we use, and then they're disposed. And if we're going to return those to the economy in a useful manner, that's in a circular economy, we have a few options. Reuse is the shortest loop to do that. And that means that it has the least energy demands and the least environmental impact, because you are changing the product the least. You're washing it out and reusing it. Mechanical recycling is a sort of intermediate step that involves grinding, sorting, and melting the plastic, but it doesn't change the basic chemical structure of the plastic. So the same polymers that were in come out of mechanical recycling, and those can be reshaped back into plastic products. Chemical recycling takes things a step further, and as I said before, it tries to break down plastic into its component monomers. In theory, this could then be fed, these outputs, the monomers can then be fed back into the plastic production process to make new plastic. In practice, they're almost always burnt as fuel. And this graphic indicates that this is automobile fuel, but I actually think I've never heard of anybody using plastic derived fuel in an automobile because automobiles require actually very clean, they're very tight specifications on the kind of fuel they can run on. So usually when it's fuel, it's fuel for some kind of an industrial furnace. Now, obviously, plastic to fuel is not a recycling process. The benefits, the environmental benefits of recycling are all in the avoided upstream production. That's less gas and less oil that we have to pump out of the ground and send to refineries with all of those impacts. If you're generating fuel, you're not really lowering the demand for that upstream process of making plastic. And so in the European Union, recycling specifically excludes plastic to fuel. But in the US, there is no legal definition of recycling, and industry deliberately conflates recycling and plastic to fuel processes. So why burn these outputs instead of turning them back into plastic? Well, the primary reason is still economic. Virgin plastic is simply too cheap to compete with. But there's also a contamination problem. Plastic is full of additives and contaminants. Sometimes even the majority of the weight of the plastic can be filler. And these come out either in the pyrolysis oil and gas or in the byproducts. Pyrolysis also creates new contaminants. So dioxin, for example, is a hydrocarbon that is produced within the pyrolysis chamber, and it's 4 times more concentrated in the outputs than it is in the plastic waste that goes in, because pyrolysis operates in that particular temperature range that is ideal for dioxin formation. So you had this heavily contaminated pyrolysis oil coming out, and in addition, the hydrocarbon mix is not pure monomers. It's a wide range of hydrocarbons that's not really suitable for plastic manufacturing. And that's why we're seeing that a lot of the output here, rather than being sent back to make more plastic, is being sent to cement kilns, for example, which is how hazardous waste is often disposed of. So the big picture here is that we don't really get a circular economy in plastic. Very little plastic can actually become new plastic. Obviously, plastic to fuel doesn't contribute to a circular economy. But even if chemical recycling is used to produce new plastic, it's not really circular. And the reason for that is that each stage of the cycle has such high energy demands that it has an enormous carbon footprint. That's certainly true in the initial recovery of fossil fuels, the cracking, the manufacturing, and then there's large carbon losses at each stage. So the heart of the process is down here at the bottom, the depolymerization purification step, which is usually a pyrolysis process. Now, it's very hard to get actual hard data about this. Industry is not forthcoming with their data, but there is one and only one facility in the United States that reports its emissions data to regulatory authorities. We got that data and analyzed it, and we found that it has an enormous carbon footprint. For every pound of plastic waste that they put in, this one step emits 2.5 pounds of carbon dioxide. So you can see that much of the mass of the plastic, much of the carbon is actually being lost as emissions in that process. And then it goes on to the next stage, that post-processing cleanup. This is where they need to strip out the contaminants, upgrade the hydrocarbons, And another 40 to 50% of carbon is lost here as CO2. That's the latest data that we're getting from Germany. So at the end of the day, very little plastic actually makes the round trip back to being plastic. Petrochemical industry really likes to talk about chemical recycling as if the process ends with this depolymerization stage at the bottom. But that next stage is critical and has a huge environmental footprint. So these high energy demands and the low yield help to explain the poor track record of chemical recycling. Since the year 2000, 37 facilities have been announced in the United States. Most of these proposals were actually plastic to fuel. Many of them were never built. Many of them are very small pilot scale operations. And now only 3 of them are actually in operation. And none of them are turning plastic back into plastic on a commercial scale. So we're constantly seeing proposals for new facilities. We're seeing these very kind of ambitious announcements of we're going to build a very large facility and we've secured investment and all of that. And the track record is that very few of these really pan out. The same thing with a lot of the technology development. You know, we've cracked a new process and it's going to be great, and you wait for it to be commercialized and it never really happens. So yeah, so these are the only 3 facilities operating in the United States. They're all pretty small scale. So with those poor economic prospects, industry is trying to tilt the playing field in their favor. Led by the American Chemistry Council, they're pushing state level legislation to change waste management policies. And this would divert plastic from mechanical recycling to chemical recycling, despite its greater environmental impacts and energy demands. This legislation has already passed in 8 states. Those are the ones in red. It's been introduced in 6 more states, and those are the ones in yellow. And part of what allows them to do this, of course, is that the technology is complex. Very few people are really up to speed on it. And also, there's no legal definition of recycling. So industry continues to call this recycling, even when they're really doing downcycling or plastic to fuel. And to make it worse, the petrochemical industry is asking for $1 billion in federal handouts under the Recover Act to subsidize their chemical recycling operations. So I want to highlight here the contrast with Europe, which is really stark. In the EU, recycling has a legal definition. I put it up there on the screen. And regulation is being aligned to create a low carbon circular economy. So they're aiming for carbon neutrality by mid-century and for 0 material losses. And those are the metrics that they are using to evaluate the technologies. Meanwhile, unfortunately, global plastic production is skyrocketing. It's been growing at 3.5% to 4% per year for decades. And anyone who's familiar with exponential growth knows where that gets you. And in case you think that that's sort of wild speculation about where we're going, industry is already building increased plastic production facilities all over the world, and those are going to be in business for decades at least. So we actually have a pretty good idea that this curve is what they are planning on doing. 2/3 of plastic's greenhouse gas emissions are from the production phase. So when we talk about the plastic problem, it's not just a waste problem, right? The problem really starts here, and it needs to be addressed here. There is no form of recycling that can compete as long as the markets are flooded with this cheap virgin plastic. So we really do have to address the overproduction in plastic. Okay, to summarize, chemical recycling is not at present a viable or a sustainable solution to plastic waste. It does not avoid the need to sort plastic waste, which is a significant cost in mechanical recycling. The technology is not yet mature, despite decades of development. It has very high energy demands and a high carbon footprint. The products are low quality. They require extensive cleanup before use. The byproducts are heavily contaminated, so there's a toxic waste stream we have to worry about. And ultimately, it's expensive, and it's more expensive than mechanical recycling. So it simply cannot compete with virgin plastic. So I'm going to wrap up there. If I haven't bored you to tears yet, you are welcome to visit our webpage, and we have lots more materials there, and you can also contact me directly. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Martha again. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil. We're going to move to questions in a second, but first I'd like to invite Delegate Love to preview the legislation that she's introducing in the 2021 General Assembly addressing chemical and advanced recycling of plastic. Sarah?
Thank you, Martha, and thank you, Neil. That presentation was amazing. Really appreciate all the information that you gave us. Very briefly, because we want to get to questions, I served on the House Environment and Transportation Committee work group on waste and recycling this past interim, along with Delegate Jen Terrassa, who's on here with us as well, and was struck in the middle of a conversation where I had made the statement, we can't recycle our way out of it. And someone on behalf of the American Chemistry Council said, oh, yes, we can. There's advanced recycling. And I was stunned. It was news to me. So started digging in and reading more, and the Gaia website is amazing and full of lots of information. And so working with some of the environmental advocates, I've got a bill that I will be introducing this session that takes pyrolysis, hydropyrolysis, well, a number of different methods that they use in this chemical conversion. I don't want to call it recycling because it's not. And it specifically says that they are not recycling. So the definition of recycling does not include any of these. And then it goes on to say that nobody may build a facility in the state that uses these chemical conversion processes. So our hope is to get ahead of the process. And as we saw with Neil's slide, the ACC is trying to get in through the back door with legislation, and we're trying to shut the door before they get in. So that's upcoming legislation, and I would love people's support for it, and feel free to reach out to me, sarah.love@house.state.md.us. Thanks so much, Martha.
Thank you both. And now let's open this for questions. I believe Delegate Lehman had a question. What happens to all the plastic bags that are collected at the grocery stores for recycling? Are they going to chemical recycling?
I don't have a comprehensive answer to that, but I suspect a lot of them are actually going to landfill because that thin film plastic has basically no market value. It's very hard to recycle, and there isn't a lot of chemical recycling, or chemical conversion, as Delegate Love says, is really the better term. There isn't a lot of capacity, so I suspect most of that is actually going to landfill, or it may be going to incineration.
Okay, thank you. We have another question here. Does Gaia consider the TerraCycle operation in New Jersey to be chemical recycling? And does the process there have to comply with Clean Air Act requirements?
So I am not very familiar with TerraCycle. I think I would have to pass on that one.
Delegate Charkoudian, would you like to ask a question?
Well, thank you. Actually, if it's okay to make a comment, I'm not sure if I'm breaking the rules now, but one of the things that we learned in the last session related to my bill that establishes clearly that incineration is not recycling. Who knew we had to state that explicitly? We learned that, in fact, because the Maryland statute currently gives credit to the Baltimore incinerator as a 5% reduction credit and allows the Montgomery County incinerator to count its ash that goes to landfill as towards its recycling credits, we found out that the plastic bags that Mom's Market had been collecting and paying to be recycled, they learned that they were going to the incinerator. And when they were outraged by this fact, they were told that because Maryland law sort of references incineration as reduction and recycling, therefore they weren't misrepresenting the recycling in charging moms for recycling and taking it to the incinerator. So it's a step away from the specific conversation we're having today, but related in the sense of the need to be very explicit in our statute about what is and isn't recycling. And so if I can just shamelessly plug my bill, which is once again coming back and clarifying that removing the credit to the incinerator for as reduction, and clarifying that incineration ash going to landfill, even when it's used as a cover, is not recycling and shouldn't be counted towards a recycling credit. And Neil, if you want to speak to any of that, I'd welcome your comments. And if you want to put it in the context of larger, policies, I think that might be helpful as well.
So so those sound like great initiatives. I would say two things. One is specifically on the incinerator. The other thing the incinerator gets credit for is renewable energy. Unfortunately, Maryland, I think it's the only state or one of only 2 states that considers incinerators to be tier 1 renewable energy for renewable energy for its RPS policy. And it would be great to remove that. The other is that as usual, there's a lot more action happening at the state level than there is at the federal level. But there are a couple of good bills that have been introduced and are going to be reintroduced into Congress next year. One is the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act, and the other is the Zero Waste Act. And so you may, as legislators, you may want to sort of look at the federal legislation and see if there's any good ideas to borrow from there, or if there's ways of harmonizing that. And then the other is that Break Free from Plastic, which is this large movement, global movement, has actually published a presidential action platform on plastic, which focuses on executive actions. Again, this is at the federal level, but since you actually have more latitude to move in the legislative means, there may be some good ideas that you would want to get out of that.
Thanks, Neil, and thanks, Laura, for that backstory on moms. I hadn't realized that Dickerson Incinerator was claiming that it was recycled in that way. It's interesting. Let's see, we have another question here. In what countries is plastic pollution growing the most?
So this is a bit of an interesting topic. I attend the international negotiations that are happening around in the possibility of creating a new treaty to control plastic pollution. And the U.S. Position, State Department's position, has been that, look, this is really only a problem in 4 Southeast Asian countries and China, because there was one study that came out about 3 years ago that said, oh, look, these are countries that have dense coastal populations and they use a lot of plastic, and so a lot of their plastic is uncontrolled and ended up in the marine environment. Another study just came out a month ago that shows that actually we've been underestimating the amount of US plastic that is ending up uncontrolled in the environment by, I forget the number, but it's a factor of 2 or 4 or something. So the US is a significant contributor to the problem. It is certainly a global problem. Plastic waste, in South Africa, they used to jokingly call plastic bags the national flower because it was something that you would just see everywhere. So I think this is one of those where we need to get our own house in order, and that will encourage action everywhere.
Another question we have here: has the American Chemistry Council introduced legislation to build any of these chemical or advanced recycling of plastic facilities?
So it has, sometimes I think working through ALEC and sometimes just through on its own, it has worked with legislators to introduce legislation that would be favorable to these facilities. Then there's a question of, do the facilities actually manage to raise the money and get the permits and all of that? And we keep seeing announcements for more facilities, but we're seeing very few actually being built.
Interesting. Can you explain what kind of legislation the ACC has been pushing in other states?
We have a legislative alert on our website that actually goes into this in a bit more detail. But some of it is about reclassifying chemical or classifying chemical conversion facilities as a form of manufacturing, so that they are subject to less scrutiny, I think, under the Clean Air Act as well as under state laws. Some of it's about defining their products as recycling, so that then they can get included in whatever recycling goals are there for the state. So they're looking for ways to kind of create a financially favorable landscape.
Is there a reason that we don't have, why is it, you showed a definition of recycling from Europe. So why is it that we don't have a legal definition of recycling in the United States?
I would actually defer to the legislators on that. I'm guessing that that's just an issue that the federal government has not taken up, and so it's been left to the states. And most of the states, Delegate Charkoudian was saying, who knew we had to define recycling to exclude incineration? Maybe we just didn't realize this was a problem until someone decided to exploit it.
Delegate Brooks would like to ask you a question. Delegate Brooks, you want to unmute and activate your video?
Unmute. Thanks for the presentation, Dr. Neal. Question: 50% of a vehicle is composed of plastic, but yet that only accounts for about maybe 10% of the weight. So how do you compete against those numbers?
I think, I mean, obviously there's a real advantage to lightweighting vehicles. I think a very small percentage of plastic production is going into vehicles at the moment. There's a surprising amount goes into our single-use plastics, the wrappers, the 3 layers of packaging that you get at Costco or the supermarket or that Amazon sends you. And unlike a vehicle, which sticks around for 20 years, the packaging is used very briefly and then immediately becomes waste. So those are the obvious places to cut down on plastic production. I think the other thing is to talk about, not only do we need to reduce the amount of plastic, but the plastic that we do produce needs to be produced in a way that it can be easily recycled. So this automotive shredder residue is in fact one of the waste streams that they've tried to do chemical conversion on. And it is, it shows up with all kinds of emissions problems and toxic byproducts, because when that's being designed, it's not thought about what the end of life is. So we need to reduce the use of, for example, multi-polymers or multi-material packaging, the use of heavy metals in plastic to give it rigidity or to give it certain colors, so that when that plastic gets to end of life, it can actually be safely recycled rather than being simply a problematic product that we don't know what to do with.
And Doc, if I can do a follow-up question, there are many types of plastic. You've got your polyethylene, your polyvinyl chloride, your polypropylene, your polystyrene,
Yes.
your plastic wrap. When we say plastic, man, I mean, it can go the gambit, So I guess the major problem would be the stuff the plastic that we use primarily for wrapping, for packaging and things of that nature, because Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, speak to that if you will.
Sure. So yes, there is, and that's part of the challenge, right? Is the chemical engineers have been given license to kind of create whatever you want as long as we can sell it to the public and don't
Mhm.
worry about what happens after it goes out the door.
Mhm.
And so they have created this bewildering variety of different polymers and different additives, and then they combine them in different ways. And then when you say, well, okay, now you need to recapture that stuff after use and recycle it, they're like, oh no, we don't want that feedstock because that's all mixed up and jumbled up. So we have this problem. One of the things I've heard is that Coca-Cola is having trouble sourcing enough recycled PET flakes to meet its own kind of voluntary sustainability goals. And you say, well, why don't you collect your own bottles? Oh, no, we put other stuff in those bottles, colorants, things to make them more rigid. We don't want that back because now we consider that plastic contaminated. Well, why are you making bottles that you don't want to turn back into new bottles, right?
Right.
So even within the same company, the right hand and the left hand are not talking to each other because there's no financial incentive for them to do so, right? The design people are like, well, what sells? And the feedstock, the folks who are in charge of sourcing their supplies, their feedstock, they're interested in maintaining quality, and nobody is in charge of making sure that that loop is completed. So this is where the American Chemistry Council steps in and says, hey, we've got a magic technology. It's going to solve all of your problems. And that's a bit of snake oil, frankly. And so what I think we really need to do is go back to the design phase and say, okay, if you're really going to make something out of plastic, then you have to have a plan for how that plastic is going to be disassembled and
Right.
recycled at the end of its life.
Right.
And we need to build that into legislation and policy because
Mhm.
companies aren't doing it on their own.
I see. Right. Okay, thanks. Thanks very much, Doc.
Thank you.
Thank you, Delegate. We have another question related to your comments on single-use plastics, Neil. What percentage of global greenhouse gas emissions do you believe is attributable to the single-use plastics?
Wow. I'm glad this isn't an oral exam. I would hate to be wrong on the percentage. At the moment, plastic production is a relatively small component of total greenhouse gas emissions. But unlike transportation or really anything else, it is growing, as we saw, at this terrific rate, 3.5% to 4% every year. So even if it's around 4 or 5% now, within 20 years, it's going to dominate our greenhouse gas footprint. So the time to deal with it is now, before all of that money is invested in new production facilities that then industry is going to say, hey, we just built this factory. You don't want us to shut it down now, right? So it is, I think, a problem that maybe we're a little bit late to nip it in the bud, but we can certainly prevent it from exploding completely out of control.
We have a question here. It seems less probable that Congress will define recycling like the EU. So would packaging extended producer responsibility legislation at the state level be a more effective approach to making real change in our region?
I'm all for it. States in the United States are as big as countries are in Europe. So I think that there's a lot to be done at the state level and a lot to be learned. And particularly when we talk about things like EPR, the laboratories of democracy, right? So I think that there's every reason to go ahead at the state level.
Great. We have a comment here about Oregon. I don't know if you're familiar with Oregon. It had a very modern sorting and recycling plant, but I assume that the questioner is talking about plastic, which a documentary said doesn't work. Do you have any comment there about the Oregon recycling?
I'm not familiar with that. Yeah.
So what alternatives can Gaia recommend to making multi-layered plastic packages? Are there any like newer materials on the horizon?
So there are people who are working on materials, compostable materials. There's like food packaging coming out now that's made out of funguses, like mushrooms that they kind of grow into clam shells, and you can take away food in that and that sort of thing. I prefer to focus on ones that are not direct material substitution, but are actually different business models. So we, part of the reason that we have a kind of a culture of disposability is because we had this very cheap substance that's easy to throw away, plastic. And, most of us here can remember when there wasn't nearly as much plastic in our lives. And certainly if we go back 50 or 60 years, there was hardly any. And the economy functioned just fine. So sometimes it's about resurrecting old business models. Like we were talking about soda before, right? There used to be, every city in America had its own bottling plant. And you actually had local jobs there where people were putting soda into glass bottles and driving them around to the local stores and picking up the used bottles. And it was a very closed, tight loop. And it did not mean that, so instead of having a handful of bottling plants shipping soda around all over the country, you actually had many more local ones. Or, one of the ones we don't actually like to talk about this very much, but I think it's important, is diapers. Diapers are a really problematic piece of the municipal solid waste stream. And, as our population is aging, we're getting more and more adult diapers too. We here in California, I'm based in the Bay Area. We have a diaper service that brings you cloth diapers every week, and then it picks them up, takes them back, puts them through industrial cleaning. And so you have cloth diapers. There's no plastic being disposed of. It has far fewer impacts, and you are supporting a local business. So I think there's all kinds of different ways that we can talk about alternatives to plastic that aren't just about substituting a different material into the same business model.
We have one questioner who asked whether the economics of the whole situation with plastic could be solved by a tax on virgin plastic, enough of a tax to make the recycled more economic.
So that's an idea that has been floated around. Our European arm, Zero Waste Europe, has actually commissioned a policy paper on a plastic tax, which I would be happy to send to anybody who's interested. I think, and I've seen a couple of other papers around it. I think that I'm not sure if the whole problem could be solved with a tax, but I do think that a tax would generate revenue, which then could be devoted to, for example, supporting municipal recycling systems, which are now struggling. So one of the things that we've suggested actually is a production tax on plastic that would then go into a national fund and be distributed to municipalities so that they could, in fact, deal with all the plastic that's being generated.
In fact, this feeds into another question, is what do you see as the best way to start digging out of the hole? What kind of extended producer responsibility legislation would you envision?
Yeah, extended producer responsibility is a big question. I think, I'm not sure if I would make a kind of a one size fits all recommendation. I think there's arguments to be made for different models in different places. We know that bottle bills, for example, work very well. We've not seen a lot of success with extended producer responsibility for, say, electronics. But I think legislation that puts some of the financial burden back on companies, but also requires them to design for recycling and design for end-of-life use. I think those would actually be my first steps to go to.
Okay. We have a question here that's related to what you were just saying. The questioner is wondering if you could talk about any creative ideas for financing better recycling systems and slowly shifting towards industrial ecology measures that utilize producer responsibility measures that make industries accountable. I think that's pretty much what you were just describing.
Yes.
Are there any good case studies, though, that you would recommend?
Oh, that's a good question. I'll have to think about that for a moment. Yeah, it's, a lot of governments are reluctant to create production taxes. So I think it's been an idea that's been a little bit slow to catch on. But I think with plastic, we're really seeing that it's such a problematic material throughout its life cycle that governments are definitely waking up to the challenge. And I mean, honestly, most of the policy response has not been around taxes, but simply around bans, like bans on certain types of single-use plastics, bans on plastic bags. So I think that's a good first step, as long as things don't end there.
That's a good point. Yes, and actually, the same questioner asked whether you have good references to share about reports on financing the success of bottle deposit programs in states that have them.
You know who does have some good information on that is the Institute for Local Self-Reliance in Washington, D.C. They have done a lot of that.
And perhaps the Container Recycling Institute?
Yes, also.
Yeah. Okay, great. What is the best approach to counter the plastics industry's falsehoods about chemical recycling? How do we go about that?
Well, I'm talking to you. And I'm glad to see that there are so many legislators here on the call. I think that that's fabulous, and I'm very happy to see delegates really engaged on the issue. I think that there's many different ways to get involved as we can think of, whether it's at the policy level, it's at the local level, whether it's getting your kids to put together a YouTube video and putting that out there. We see lots of interesting initiatives. Talking to your friends and neighbors, even if we have to do it over Zoom these days. I think, I don't think that there's any one way. I think it's whatever works best for you. The policy wonks or want to get into the details of the policy, and that's much needed. And the engineers need to start thinking about how do we redesign some of the stuff that we build. And if you're good on social media, then there's lots of opportunities there. So I think it's all needed.
One questioner asks, China was taking a lot of our plastics, but it isn't now. So what were they doing with all the plastics over there? I mean, you see the story of plastic, and I believe Plastic Wars also highlighted them burning plastic.
Yeah, it's what we call dirty recycling. And it's very difficult to report on that in China, but we actually issued a report on the plastic waste dumping in other parts of Southeast Asia, where literally they'll just bring in a load of foreign plastic waste and dump it on a field, and people go through and they'll pick out by hand the scraps of PET or HDPE that have some recycling value, and they'll sort all of that by hand, and then whatever is left just gets burned, either out in the open in a field, or we actually found them using it as fuel in a local factory to make tofu, which I don't want to eat that tofu. There was a level of recycling happening. Some of that waste was being recovered, particularly like with electronics. It was actually unfortunately common practice to burn off the plastic to get at the wires and the metal, which had more recycling value. But it's a very dirty, very polluting, and terrible for the workers' health process. So China finally said, well, we're not going to be the world's dumping ground anymore. And now we are we're watching the plastic waste trade actually look for other countries. So there was a big shift towards Southeast Asia. Most of those countries closed their doors. Now we're trying to figure out if some of it's going to Central America or to West Africa. And we're talking to people there so that they can be aware of those and try to track those down.
Delegate Lehman, Mary Lehman has a question. Mary, you want to unmute?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Martha. And I apologize. I cannot figure out how to use that Q&A button. I can't figure out how to post a question. I only see other people's questions and their answers. So yeah, so I thank you. Great presentation. Neil, I have been working in the 2021 session will be my third year of trying to address sort of environmentally responsible and transparent ways of disposing of artificial turf playing fields, both the grass, the carpet, and the what's usually crumb tire infill. And one of the things we ran into the first year, and we've sort of never figured out a way to address this, is, environmentalists talked about the importance of closed loop recycling, that would be the preference on how, the best way in a perfect world to deal with it. Well, it turns out there are no closed loop recycling facilities. It's great in theory, but you can't legislate something that doesn't exist. So I guess that's somewhat of a statement, but also a question. It's like a chicken or an egg kind of thing. What are we to do about that reality?
Yeah, that's a tough one. We definitely have closed loop recycling for metals and for glass and for those materials that can kind of make the whole loop and not lose their intrinsic qualities. Plastic, we don't. Mechanical recycling is usually a downcycling process, and I'm not going to repeat what I said earlier about chemical recycling. So it's not an easy one. And I think, to me, that speaks to the need to go upstream and say, well, why are we producing stuff in the first place that we don't know what we're going to do with at the end of its lifetime? That, of course, does not address the immediate issue that you're dealing with, which is, okay, the stuff has been produced. It's on the playground. It needs to go somewhere. I think with a lot of those plastic products, honestly, probably the best of the bad options is usually landfill, because it's relatively inert and it's less likely to end up off-gassing or mobilizing into the groundwater or something like that than if it goes to an incinerator.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Thanks.
But I will also add, if you hear about a better option, I would love to know about it.
Neil, there's a question here about the impact of requiring recycled content in plastic containers. What is the impact of that? Is that actually just kicking the can down the road, or?
So I think that helps, and it, of course, we have to define what we mean by recycled content, which goes back to the legal definitions question. But I think when there's a legal requirement for companies to use that recycled content, then it does stimulate the mechanical recycling market, because now they're willing to pay for that plastic, which takes money to collect from everybody and wash and chip and melt and all of that. And it hopefully also builds in an incentive for them to redesign their products so that the plastic that they're producing can actually go through that mechanical recycling process again. That's where I think they need an additional little kick. But I'm a fan of recycled content laws. I certainly don't know of any negative repercussions from any of them.
How many times can that plastic mechanical recycling result in a new plastic item?
Yeah, not very many times.
Right.
That's why I say that there isn't really circular, closed loop recycling in plastics. Certainly, it's better to recycle plastic than landfill it and then produce a new plastic item from virgin plastic. So it is a significant part. It does really reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. It reduces the solid waste impact. But yes, there is a limit to how many times it can go around the loop before it simply degrades too much.
Okay, we're nearing the end of the webinar. I'd want to see whether there are any more delegates who have questions. I can read a few more here from the list. Anyone who hasn't asked a question yet?
I think Delegate Love had her hand up at one point.
Delegate Love, did you have a question?
Oh, thank you. I think I was going to address something that had been said, but I forgot.
Sorry.
So I just want to ask Neil, are you seeing an understanding in legislatures of the challenges with chemical conversion, or are you seeing people get sucked in by the term recycling?
I would say the latter. I think many, this is a really recent push. The whole kind of issue of plastic has impacted the public very recently, and I think there's not a lot of information out there. So when the American Chemistry Council shows up and says, "Hey, we have this great new technology," if people don't know anything else about it, then it's easy to think, well, that sounds good. I'm glad you solved your problem. I am, of course, always skeptical about the same company coming to me saying that, oh, we solved the problem that we created for the last 40 years. So maybe your fellow legislators could learn a little more of that skepticism, but I think that what's important is to get, accurate information out there.
Got it. Thank you. And then Thomas pointed out in the chat that it was about EPR. In the discussion about EPR and packaging, Delegate Learman will have a bill this session to address EPR and packaging. So thank you, Thomas.
Great, thanks.
I'll read one more question here, and I think we should probably wrap it up. And I promise to collect the remaining questions that haven't been answered and send them to Neil in an email afterwards. One last question. Are there any examples of government at any level supporting businesses who operate using refill stations and reducing the need even for recycling? And the questioner says, full disclosure, this is what she does as a business.
That's an interesting question. I know of many refill businesses. Whether there is policy that specifically supports that, I think the policy changes that I've heard around that have been around rewriting, for example, health and sanitation codes to allow refill businesses to operate, because in many cases, the codes were written on the presumption that everybody was going to use single-use plastic. So you have to take your cup, like the plastic cup that is given, and walk out of the shop with it. And so allowing people to say bring in their own container and refill it sometimes requires those kinds of policy tweaks.
Right. Well, thank you, Neil. Thank you, Sarah, and thank all the delegates and all the great questions from the people who've attended. We're pretty much done now. There's a recording of the webinar, and we will be posting it on the Sierra Club website, and also I'll send you a link as soon as we have it up. And I should point out also that one of the questioners spoke to the film Plastic Wars from Frontline, and that we are having a discussion, a Sierra Club, Maryland Sierra Club next, I believe it's Thursday, yes, Thursday the 17th, of Plastic Wars. And if you'd be interested in that, go to the Maryland Sierra Club website and you can register for that discussion. Thank you also, by the way, to Gary Young, our technical support. Great job, Gary. Thank you very much. And Neil will be back in touch with you. I'm sure that a lot of people will be back in touch with you based on what's gone on this evening. Thank you again.
Fair enough. Thank you very much. I really appreciate all of you coming out for your evening.
So everyone take care, stay safe, and have a happy holiday. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.